How's it hanging, everyone? It's Jake the Ashen Hollow, and today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, and that is the identity of the Furtive Pygmy. So if you would like to hear my opinion on who it is and the conclusions that led me there, then buckle on up. But first, let me give a shout out to my buddies Leo and Zinja for sitting in Skype with me for hours on end as we peeled this bad boy back and all the mystery to be had. So, before we jump into who I believe it is, let's first talk about the most common theory of the identity of the Furtive Pygmy, which is Manus, the father of the Abyss. So in order to introduce my theory, I'll have to tell you why I don't think Manus can be the Pygmy. So first, let's read the Soul of Manus. It says, "Soul of Manus, father of the Abyss. This extraordinary soul is a vicious, lukewarm lump of gentle humanity. Ancient Manus was clearly once human, but he became the father of the Abyss after his humanity went wild, eternally seeking his precious broken pendant." So there are just two things here I want to point out. First, it says that Manus' soul is just a lump of gentle humanity. Just a lump. It kind of sounds like something that isn't very good. Certainly not something that's befitting of a lord soul. A lump. Secondly, it says that Manus was clearly once human. Now, there are several races in Dark Souls, but we really never learn the name of the race that is most closely related to the gods of Anor Londo. You know, people like Ornstein, Artorias, the Silver Knights, and people like that. But I think that each of the procurers of Lord Souls are mostly just labeled as deities, then their races, for all intents and purposes, followed with bits of their souls. So it would seem more fitting for the Furtive Pygmy to not have been a human, but rather a god of sorts, who simply distributed the Dark Soul throughout their people. So if Manus is the prime evil or ancient man, then he doesn't really fit the bill. So let's take a slight rabbit trail and look into who I believe Manus was and what he is before his eventual descent into madness. First, I think it is important to have some understanding of what the Abyss could be. To me, I think that the Abyss is just the natural progression of the world. We know the Age of Dark is an inevitability, but by linking the first flame, Gwyn prolonged the Age of Fire, which has been perpetuated time after time. I believe the Abyss is just simply nature's reaction to this prolonged Age of Fire. It knows that the Age of Dark should be here. Think of it like a more intense climate change of sorts, or what climate change is thought to be, for those of you who don't believe in it yourself. If that makes sense, I believe Manus became at some point a magnet of sorts for humanity. Whether it be intentional or not, a thought could be that he was supposed to be the first, and I put this in quotations, Firekeeper. So all the humanity without anywhere to go just continued to pile onto Manus until eventually he couldn't handle the weight of it anymore and snapped, which I believe may be a testament to why we never see any male Firekeepers. We know a Firekeeper's soul is an infinite draw for humanity, and perhaps the male body just can't handle all the humanity, as seems apparent in the case of Manus. That and the fact that we only find twin humanities in Dark Souls 1 on female corpses. But I digress. As for the role Manus played before his corruption, I believe he was intended to be the Dark Lord at some point, possibly the first attempt at one but failed. There's this piece of dialogue from Dark Stalker Koth.
"They failed me, every last one of them. They were strong, but saw not the truth. I am certain that you will prove different."
Which leads me to believe there were several other failed attempts at finding the Dark Lord to usher in the Age of Dark. Another piece of evidence I believe supports this is the Dark Hand in Dark Souls 1. Its description says, "The Dark Wraiths incited by Koth use the power of the Dark Soul to absorb humanity, an art shared by this weapon, which also acts as a special shield. The Ancients, particularly, could sap the humanity of even a replete saint in the blink of an eye." So what I want to focus on most from this description is the mention that the Ancients particularly could sap the humanity of even a replete saint in the blink of an eye. What I think that is trying to say is that the Ancients probably made the best use of this weapon and or were the most skilled with it. So let's take a listen to something else Koth says, in particular what he says about giving the player the Dark Hand.
If you wish, I shall grant the art of life drain, the legendary power of the Dark Lord.
The legendary power of the Dark Lord. So to me, there has to have been more attempts at creating a Dark Lord. Manus, the primeval man, primeval being synonymous to ancient, it seems to me that Manus is among the ancient in which the Dark Hand mentions to have been particularly skilled in the Dark Hand art, probably as he was meant to be the Dark Lord. As to what happened in that time period and why it is that the other attempted Dark Lords failed, well, we may never know, but I thought it was important for me to point out my thoughts on the identity of Manus in detail to disprove him as the Furtive Pygmy. Okay, so now's the moment you've probably been waiting for me to spill out, who I think the Furtive Pygmy is. And the answer to that is Velka. Now hold on to your britches, because there's a lot of information behind this thought and the evidence that led me to this conclusion, so try to keep up. Alright, so let's get some of the more obvious connections I made out of the way first. When I think of the name Velka in reference to Dark Souls, I think two things: Goddess of Sin and Rogue Deity. So if we look at the word rogue, it can mean a lot of things, but basically it means a mischievous person. The only thing we know about the one who procured the Dark Soul was that they were a pygmy, meaning small, which makes sense because humans are significantly shorter than the other races, and that they were furtive. Furtive meaning secretive, also meaning to avoid notice because of guilt, which seems to go hand in hand with rogue. They obviously don't mean the exact same thing, but they certainly mesh very well together. I also think it is fitting with furtive meaning to avoid attention because of a sense of guilt would apply to the Goddess of Sin. There are several things here I believe are very befitting of the Goddess of Sin, and that is one. So something I believe that is likely is that whomever procured the Dark Soul would likely be a deity of sorts, just as the three who found the other Lord Souls are, and that just makes sense to me. So with Velka being a goddess, I believe that is another point she gets in her race for Furtive Pygmy. So now we'll talk about the pygmy aspect of things. So like I mentioned earlier, in Dark Souls there are several different races, and for the most part the only differences seem to be size and perhaps skin tone, as the giants seem greenish, I suppose, but a lot of them are very humanoid. I believe all these beings from the Dark followed their respective lords who procured their own Lord Soul and were essentially part of that same race, but have their own unique sub-races, if that makes any sense. So think of lions, tigers, leopards, etc. They're all cats, they're all felines, but they also have traits that make them unique. I think it is the same sort of situation with the races of Dark Souls. So Pygmy is interesting, as they would be much smaller than everyone else, just like I mentioned before, all of the humans were. So it's obvious to see humans' connection to a Pygmy, even if we didn't already know that their humanity is just fragments of the Dark Soul. So what I found very curious was the statues of Velka we see in Dark Souls 1 and 3. They are very much human-sized statues, which I think is likely to indicate an accurate representation of her. The statues we see of Lord Gwyn and Guinevere, and where the Firstborn would have a statue, were very large, likely the size we would expect them to be, even the size that we see the illusion of Guinevere to be. Now obviously that alone isn't enough to say that she is the Furtive Pygmy, but I think noting the intentional size of her statues is definitely important. So something else we know to be related to Velka is the Painted World. Now I don't know if I would call the Painted World Velka's domain, as I don't believe she resides there, but I believe she is the deity the beings who reside there worship, as well as we find several things that are tied to her within the Painted World. And while we find no evidence of the Painted World in Dark Souls 3, we can find some of its denizens, in the Corvians for example, scattered throughout the land. Which, for more detail on the Corvians and the Painted World, I'll leave a link in the description to a detailed video I made on it, but for now we're just going to point out a couple of things. I think it is important to label the Painted World, and what I mean by that is it a prison or is it a sanctuary? The common thought has always been that the Painted World is a prison, but I don't believe that to be the case. I think the Painted World is a sanctuary for unwanted and forgotten souls set up by Velka. So let's look into explaining this. The peculiar doll in Dark Souls reads, There was once an abomination who had no place in this world. She clutched this doll tightly and eventually was drawn into a cold and lonely painted world. Which we know is in reference to Priscilla, but let's just remember what this doll said and we'll circle back to that in a moment. Next, I'll read the description for the soul of Priscilla and the Life Hunt Scythe. Soul of Priscilla says, Soul of Priscilla the crossbreed trapped inside the painted world of Ariamis. And the Life Hunt Scythe reads, Scythe born from the soul of Priscilla, the stark white crossbreed trapped inside the painted world of Ariamis. Even the gods feared Priscilla's life hunt ability, and in the hands of a mortal its power will turn upon its wielder. There isn't any references to being imprisoned that I can find. It specifically states that Priscilla is trapped. It doesn't say she was trapped into here by so-and-so, it just says trapped, which makes me think of trapped as in she is there for her own protection. Like she is trapped in there because if she leaves, those who fear her could strike her down. Just like we know in Dark Souls 3 when Aldrich devoured Gwendolyn, he dreamed of a young pale girl in hiding, not a young pale girl imprisoned. Also, when the player wants to leave the world, they are told by Priscilla,
If thou hast misstepped into this world, plunge down from the plank and hurry home.
So if leaving the painted world is as easy as stepping off the ledge directly behind Priscilla, there's no way she is imprisoned there by the gods. Trapped as in she can't leave for the sake of her own safety is a lot more likely. So again, the painted world seems to me a lot more likely to be a sanctuary rather than a prison. This is particularly important, especially if we're considering Velka to be the Furtive Pygmy, since being the pygmy would basically make her the mother of humanity. So let's take a look at a couple more sources that point to the painted world being a sanctuary, and why that is such an imperative thing in regards to what makes Velka, Velka. The Painting Guardian crown in Dark Souls 3 reads, Attire of the Painting Guardians whose forms are described in the mythology of heretics. The hunchbacked teller of ancient tales describes unwanted souls who are unwelcome across the lands and are eventually drawn into a cold, painted world. So unwanted, unwelcome, and essentially forgotten souls are drawn into the painted world. The hunchbacked teller of ancient tales here, I believe, are the Corvian storytellers, since they are also related to the painted world and Velka. If we read their staff, it says, Staff of a heretical storyteller who shares tales of the painted world to forlorn souls. So there is another word for all of that, forlorn, which means desolate, lonely, or forsaken. Forsaken in the definition is what really stood out to me, because forsaken also means forgotten, and I think that is a big deal here, as well as the term unwanted to describe these souls. What typically happens to unwanted things? They are forgotten. Velka creating the painted world for forgotten souls, that is yet another thing that would be incredibly befitting of the Furtive Pygmy, because what is the one thing we learn about the Pygmy in the opening cinematic for Dark Souls?
And the Furtive Pygmy, so easily forgotten.
And for a last bit of evidence towards the painted world being a sanctuary, we have the Painting Guardian sword, which says, Curved sword of Anor Londo painting guards, unique shape with flat tip. The guardians who strike down those who dare threaten the painting. They strike down those who dare threaten the painting, not those who dare threaten to leave the painting. This also goes hand in hand with why they have their backs to the painting. If they were guarding it as if it were a prison, their backs certainly would not be turned. So with all of that, I firmly believe that the painted world is a sanctuary for Velka's people, which would be humans and the forgotten souls. I think it is also used to store things she wishes to hang on to, things such as the Dark Ember, and its description says, The church long hid the forbidden black ember, and no living blacksmith knows of it. Occult weapons were used to hunt the gods and are effective against their following and kin. Now, a common thought that goes along with the belief that the painted world is a prison made by the gods comes from this description, which is that the church hid the forbidden black gem, which I say, 1, refer to all the evidence I provided on the contrary, and 2, it says the church long hid, which sounds past tense, as in it is no longer hidden. We find it in an area with direct ties to Velka, and we find it in the open, so it seems more likely to me that Velka reacquired her ember and safely stashed it in the Painted World. But why is that ember a big deal? And why do we only find occult weapons in Dark Souls 1? I think the answer is a simple solution. They simply renamed it to Dark. Occult weapons scale with faith, just as the Dark infusion does in Dark Souls 3. We also get occult weapons from the Dark Ember, so that seemed like an obvious connection to me. Just like we don't get divine weapons in Dark Souls 3, instead they are called blessed. Same thing, different word. But occult is used for hunting gods, which seems particularly useful for the goddess of sin. And what else is fascinating in Dark Souls 1 is that there are only 3 unique weapons that come with occult damage by default. And they all tie in so perfectly together, it's amazing. They are the Dark Hand, Priscilla's dagger, and of course Velka's rapier. Brilliantly tied together, right? If you haven't already gotten the link between Koth and his Dark Wraiths and Velka, I'll put a link to my video about the Sable Church of Londor in the description. The occult or dark weapons scale with faith, which indicate to me that they have to be the product of a deity. If it wasn't, then the faith would mean nothing, so I believe that to be a solid connection to Velka being behind the Dark Ember. She has it placed in her world for safekeeping, it scales on faith, and she is a deity. It is used to hunt gods, and she is the goddess of sin who metes out punishment. With the way weapon advances work in Dark Souls 3, with using gems to infuse your weapon to a certain type, whereas in Dark Souls 1 we used embers to make certain types, I think it's safe to assume that the gems in Dark Souls 3 are likely the products of their respective embers. So if that is the case, we could say that the dark gems simply come from the Dark Ember. And the description of Dark Gem reads, a gem of infused titanite born of disembodied humanity. Dark weapons inflict dark damage and scale with faith. Disembodied meaning separating from or existing without the body. Basically meaning this is pure humanity, something we haven't seen in Dark Souls 3. So if this is all related to Velka, it would appear that she is creating these gems from humanity, and who else can really achieve that feat besides the holder of the Dark Soul itself? So this was a pretty large selling point for me, but there are just a few more things to cover. So now let's look at the Undead Curse and Velka's role in it and humanity. There are some who believe that we aren't really sure what caused the Undead Curse. Then there are some that believe that Gwyn linked the flame to humanity, thus creating the curse. Both of those beliefs are perfectly understandable, but now that I'm exploring the prospect of Velka being the Furtive Pygmy, let me offer another thought on that matter. So we know at some point the Furtive Pygmy spread their soul to create humans, but we aren't exactly sure when. But I don't think humans always had the Undead Curse. In fact, I believe the Undead Curse did not appear until after Gwyn linked the flame. But I do believe that the humans had already been around for some time. Let's listen to an interesting bit from Koth's dialogue.
Your ancestor claimed the dark soul and waited for fire to subside, and soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark, clinging to his Age of Fire, and in dire fear of humans, and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them. Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord.
Many believe that Gwyn's actions are considered to be the first sin, and I'm inclined to agree with that thought. I think with Velka being a goddess of sin, her outlooks on the world would be fairly just. I'm inclined to believe she is for the natural flow of time, without any obstructions, and when Gwyn created an obstruction, she waged war against the gods, and against the Age of Fire. I believe she placed the Undead Curse on her own people as a constant barrage towards Gwyn and the Flame, but considering the events of Dark Souls 1, that plan obviously didn't pan out. Whether it was just unsuccessful or the undead were manipulated by the gods and their followers, like Frampt for example, into believing something else. In fact, Anastasia of Astora believes that if you link the flame again, the Undead Curse will be gone.
Framt has told me of you, that you have agreed to link the fire. I thank you sincerely. Finally, the curse of the undead will be lifted, and I can die human. I am powerless, but I will do all that I can. Please, save us all. Please.
So we know the manipulation game is strong. We can also consider how incredibly easy it is to encounter Framt in the game as opposed to Koth. Heck, most people would never even know Koth was there if they didn't stumble upon a video or a guide that covered it. So it seems that the gods played a very clever battle and won over the undead, since the canon ending to Dark Souls 1 is the linking of the flame. That doesn't mean it would stop Velka from trying, carrying the chosen undead to Lordran herself. That's right, I'm talking about the giant crow. Were you expecting it to be someone else? It just makes too much sense to be Velka, ushering over her chosen champion to dish out the punishment of sin to the gods. They are, after all, her most powerful champion, taking all the gods down, even Gwyn himself, but inevitably falling prey to Framt's manipulations of extending the Age of Fire. As I was digging into the etymology of Velka, I discovered a Finnish translation meaning debt, or a life debt in particular. To me, that is a large reference to the Dark Soul, since we know the soul was distributed amongst the humans, which arguably have had the largest population of the races, at least from what we've concluded from different references in the game. So with the Dark Soul granting them all their humanity or life, they would certainly owe that to the Pygmy. So in Dark Souls 3, we see Velka continuing her battle to usher in the Age of Dark and restore the natural order of time through the Sable Church of Londor. We meet Yuria in the game and learn she is one of the three sisters that founded the church. I believe through Velka's command, as we see how heavily she ties into the foundations of this church. When we think of her as the Furtive Pygmy, it makes sense for her to be the figurehead of a Church of Hollows set on bringing about the dark. In my video on the Sable Church, I presented the idea that Velka could be the unmentioned sister of the church, but with this new revelation I've had about Velka, I think she fits the bill of mother to the three daughters a lot better. Which, Velka being the mother was also an idea Vati had in his Londor video, which was brilliant by the way, and I'll put a link for that in the description as well. I believe Yuria and her sisters are meant to be somewhat reminiscent of the Pardoners from Dark Souls 1, which we know for an absolute fact that the Pardoners served Velka, and while technically speaking the Sable Church is under Velka's influence is still speculation, it still seems too incredibly likely to not be fact. So one more thing I've discovered is the similarities between the mask of Velka worn by the Pardoners and the build mask worn by the Sisters of the Sable Church. You can just see the similarities in the design. The engravings in the middle follow a very similar design, and the way the middle concaves down to appear like a beak. My guess being that a beak of a crow, which do I need to say represents Velka? Well, I guess either way I did. And for shits and giggles, I'll add the Painting Guardian hood to the image as well, so you can draw the similarities it shares with those other masks too. All these things circle back around to Velka time and time again, which when looking at it from the perspective that Velka could be the Furtive Pygmy, well, it just all makes too much sense to me. So that's my opinion on the matter, and I'm sticking to it. Not to mention, the statue of Velka in the undead settlement can also cure hollowing, which is particular to humans and to the Dark Soul, so that's another very curious fact about it. So again, let me remind you that the things presented to you in this video are simply my own interpretations and in no way are considered fact or canon. Thus is Dark Souls, filling in blanks and enjoying healthy speculation. But thanks for watching everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and as always, make sure you tell me your thoughts and theories in the comments. I love hashing these things out with you guys. So thanks again everyone, and I'll catch you next time.